Hello, my name is Jeremy Ive. I'm the Senior Advisor to Relational Peacebuilding Initiatives. And this webinar is part of our series on what Relational Peacebuilding Initiatives calls a mutual convergent development process, which is something envisaged in the case of conflicts, which have then hopefully come to a pause or an end, but there's the need for peace building. It might seem strange to lump the situation in the Korean Peninsula together with that in Ukraine. One has an armistice in place, the other is a continuing conflict. But we believe that the features of a process of peace building is similar for both situations, and there's something to be learned in comparing them. So I'm going to move forward. What hope is there for the future in the Korean Peninsula and the Russian-Ukraine situation? Here we are drawing on methodology, what we call track 2 methodology, that is building an informal process, an informal network of links across the divides, building consensus and coming to a continuing view of how that can be developed in the case of post-conflict situations. How do we build peace? For this, we need a roadmap. We need a clearly set out set of phases. We need a trust-building process, which is what we're investigating, and then this will hopefully lead then to a peaceful outcome for the future. In doing so, we're using the principles of relational proximity, which have come from the Relationships Foundation. And here I refer to the relational lens, published by Cambridge University Press in 2016, setting out these principles of parity, mutual dignity and respect, directness, continuity, time and stability, multiplexity, breadth of knowledge, and commonality. This emphasizes the quality of communication, the duration of interactions, the depth of knowledge, the fairness in power dynamics, and the alignment of purpose. So we see 3 necessary foundations for building trust: mutual knowledge, mutual respect, values and goals alignment. And this is going beyond what happens at the high level, but is focusing on the intermediate level, so that as these features can be built into the interrelation of those involved at the intermediate level, so this will flow through to the whole context. Here we need to think about the why and the how of mutual knowledge, that mutual knowledge drives empathy, is built into face-to-face meetings, that it needs appropriate balance of privacy, transparency, and accountability. And then we do this through building mutual perceptions of fairness, enabling participation, encouraging recognition of both rights and responsibilities, and then aligning values and goals. These are vital. This is a vital process to build non-coercive cooperation and enabling organizations and societies to work peacefully and effectively, and it's implicit in all models of economic growth and social welfare. Now we come to the mutual convergent development process in particular. We believe that this process, which RPI has developed in the case of Korea, but also is applying in the case of Ukraine, Russia, is a way to gain interest and support of all. It's not total integration. In other words, it requires a process rather than coming to a fixed end immediately. It involves building shared values as part of that process, and it proceeds in steps by agreement. So here's the setting out of the whole process. We've already, in our previous webinars, have dealt with phases 1, 2, 3, and these apply to both situations, to the Korean Peninsula, as well as to the Ukraine situation. So in the Korean Peninsula, it applied to having a KPAC, a Korean Peninsula agriculture community, around a bilateral trade agreement focused on agricultural exchanges, then a KPEC, expansion of that to all goods in economic alignment, then social convergence, and then confederation, moving to the federation of provinces with a multi-connected neutral Peninsula. And then in the case of Ukraine, the Ukraine area, starting in the lower reaches of the Dnipro River with a lower Dnipro water, energy, and environment community, then moving that towards a common business, trade, and financial area, then social convergence and confederation, and then federation of oblasts with multi-connected neutral Ukraine. So this is a process. And so confederation, as you see, comes into that process. Now, here's a view of the whole of the confederation. So the confederation here is linking two separate ideological bases. If you just, those are just some notional, they don't have any particular significance. They're just two separate ideological emblems, but it's linked by a confederal arrangement at the center. So you've got there the drawing together of these different ideologies with a third way which bridges them both, transcending them both through the establishment of a transitional political structure and building trust in the process. But it's also a de-risking process because, in other words, it doesn't commit the two sides to a final solution or final outcome because they can move back from it. It de-risks that reunification process and sustains momentum, keeps the process going from what has happened before, and it bridges the divide between those two ideological positions. So you then move on to the reversible two-state confederation. We're having a constituent assembly with representatives drawn from the provinces or the areas of both entities. So we have this formal structure. And then we have a whole series of partnership bodies focused each on one of the key areas of cooperation which we've identified. So these three areas are education, health, and justice. So that, in other words, by working together across those divides of education, health, and justice, we can be building a way of working together across those divides. So that we have built common healthcare principles, common educational values, and common justice principles, which then can hold the two sides of those divides together. So moving forward, so healthcare convergence. So in other words, what we're trying to do is provide a third way in each of those key areas of cooperation. First of all, there's the idea of relational quality of care. In other words, focusing on the parent, the patient, and the provider, and building those key relationships with the healthcare professional. So in other words, focused more on the relationships between the carers and those who are being cared for, rather than simply commodifying healthcare. Secondly, having social support. In other words, that there should be a way of seeing the healthcare not just in isolation, but in their whole social context, with support for their families and other networks, and then integrating the system so that the different healthcare systems work together, not simply broken down into isolated entities and inefficiencies. So then we have education convergence with focus on relational literacy. In other words, focusing on helping young people, especially, or old ages as well, to build good relationships with one another and to have good relational literacy. That is, be aware of the different patterns of relating and how these can best be developed. And then having relational pedagogy, that's to implement a defined pastoral structure where a staff member or pedagogue is designated to mentor and walk alongside young people through their journey, and then having relational values, ensuring evaluation school culture to treat students with fairness and respect and penalizing deceit and dishonesty. In other words, building in that moral framework into the educational process. So that's education. Then with justice, bring the sort of ways justice could be brought together, is to restore that we focus on the restorative goal, that justice is not just about punishment, but it is also about restoring those who have broken the law, to restore the relationships which are involved. And then seeing also a way of recompensing the victims of crime, and devolving justice as far as possible through local institutions, drawing in local communities into the process, and transforming the prison process so that these aren't simply warehousing criminals, but are reforming them and helping them to be reintegrated back into society. So those are things which can be built on across the divides, transcending the different ideological bases on which each is coming from. So now let us look at the specifics of the different situations. In the case of Korea, you've got, of course, the de facto partition, 1945 to 98 to 48, and then that was adjusted through the course of the war very slightly, with the armistice coming into effect in 1953. But here we would envisage a constituent assembly drawn from the provinces of North and South Korea, based perhaps in Kaesong, which was the ancient capital of Korea, just north of the DMZ, between the two sides, with a small executive to implement the Constituent Assembly policy decisions, and then having these different partnership bodies to implement convergence in those different areas which we've identified already, but I'll come back. I'll just cover in terms of the specifics of the different contexts. First, as we see in North Korea, looking at preventative healthcare, integrating the North Korean strengths with the South Korean advancements. In the case of North Korea, with the community focus, and then in the case of South Korea, with their highly developed medical techniques, so that the advantages of both can be best drawn upon. And then again, with education convergence, so that the students are encouraged to think about how to build empathy and respect across those divides, coming from very different positions and very different backgrounds, looking at the importance of community in both cases, rather than the very highly developed individualism of the South or the very autocratic understanding in the North, and then engendering fairness and respect with clear penalties for deceit and dishonesty, again, as we've been outlining in general terms. So then the case of justice, of coming to a convergent position there, finding a way to build a relational criminal justice system. In the North, it's tended to focus on anti-status offenses, and then the South, it's very much individualized. But the two things could be drawn together much better by focusing again on repairing relationships and building the notion of community rights and privileges. And then moving to the case of Ukraine with de facto partition, looking at the divides that there are. Of course, there's the Russian-occupied area in the southeast of the Ukraine area. How do you bridge those divides? And in a way analogous to what happened in Korea with the armistice across the peninsula there. So we have here again the structure of the Confederation with the Constituent Assembly meeting at a common point, and with a small executive to implement the policy, and then again with partnership bodies to focus cooperation in those different areas. So we have then healthcare convergence, bringing together the existing Ukrainian universal healthcare system, at the moment challenged by underfunding, inefficiency, and corruption, and war indeed. And then with the south, with the area in the south, taking advantage of the range of opportunities there are to build health, and supported by those involved in the process, focusing on the care, the high quality of relationships in both again, and having a focus again on the communities devolving the health care as much as is possible. And then with education, having integration of education through relational literacy, as we've described. There's a good example here in the case of German unification, where the very different experiences of Western and East Germany had to be integrated into a new educational system, focusing on the values of mutual duties and responsibilities, loyalty and faithfulness, compassion, generosity and kindness, fairness and justice, and respect for everyone by everybody else. So there are good lessons to be learned from other situations, but focusing especially on the importance of relational values and how these principles of relationality could be worked through. Then we have the history teaching. So in other words, just as we've discussed in the case of the Korean Peninsula, learning empathy with and understanding of different ways and different backgrounds and different paths by which people have come to their current situations. Then with a more locally focused education structure, and allowing the different provinces to work out their education system into the local situations. And then we have justice convergence, shifting the focus from an adversarial process to a much more relational system of justice, recognizing crime as a relational event, relational disruption, but then the need then for relational restoration. Devolving again justice as much as possible to local areas, and focusing on the importance of rehabilitation, and then finally maintaining family values, family relationships in the process. And then finally, moving to the next phase, which we'll be doing in our next webinar, we'll be moving to a federation of provinces and oblasts with multi-connected neutrality. So this builds on what we've done in our previous webinars and looks forward to the next webinar, looking at a multi-connected neutral Korean Peninsula, or in the case of Ukraine, a multi-connected neutral Ukraine. But this is all holding together what's happened before. And another thing is important to understand, that the whole confederal process is not a discrete phase limited by a certain point of its beginning or ending. It's a focused process. In other words, there could be a lot of convergence happening before, and there's a continuing convergence happening afterwards. And so the reason why we're just dealing with healthcare, education, and justice in this phase is that these are three areas which could have been worked on together before, but the confederal structure allows a focus for these to be brought together in a specific way, in a way that does not finalize it in a way that would be threatening to either side, allows to have both sides to have the framework to work together in anticipation of the final arrangements, which would still accommodate as much as possible the diversity of the different backgrounds and experiences from which those on both sides of the divide may be coming from. I'm also aware that in covering this, I've had to move very fast in a very sketchy way over each of those areas. Each of them really deserves a webinar of its own, as indeed does the whole confederal view of things. And I think that would deserve each of them a webinar on its own. But this is something we need to think about and work out how, as RPI, to provide this in the future. Thank you very much for your attention.